You've referenced a few times, not just a few times, but a few times even in this conversation, many times since, including your article, that the Russians regard NATO expansion into Ukraine or significant Western influence into Ukraine as some grave threat to their security, as basically an existential threat. And you also talked about how the Russians believe the West can't be trusted. One of the big agreements that is often cited by people like yourself, even leftist scholars like Noam Chomsky as well, is the fact that when Germany reunified, which is obviously a huge threat to Russia, they agreed to accept that, provided that NATO never move 1 inch east beyond Germany. And of course, NATO has repeatedly moved well east, closer and closer to the Russian border. But the argument is, we did do that. We did move east. NATO did move east toward the Russian border. Russia never went to war over that. What is so uniquely threatening about Ukraine from the Russian perspective that they consider this particular kind of expansion to be an existential threat?
Right on their border, and it's a huge piece of real estate. The first tranche of NATO expansion, the first major tranche, took place in 1999, and it involved Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Now, it's important to understand that the Russians screamed bloody murder about that expansion, that first tranche, but they couldn't do anything about it. They were too weak in 1999. This is before Putin even becomes president. Yeltsin is the president at the time. So the Russians were too weak to do anything about it. But furthermore, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic are quite a distance away from the Russian border. The second big tranche takes place in 2004, and this is when the Baltic states come in. This is when Romania comes in, Slovenia, and a few other countries. The Russians, again, scream bloody murder, and there's not much they can do about this one either, because they're still too weak. This is 2004. Putin has been in power for 4 years. The Russians are coming back from the dead, but they're not all the way there yet. And furthermore, although the Baltic states are close to the Russian border, they're really not a meaningful threat in any way. Then the next big expansion is going to be Ukraine and Georgia. That's the third big tranche. And the Russians put down their foot and they say that this is not going to happen. And just to focus on Ukraine, you want to remember Ukraine is a big piece of territory right on Russia's border. And the idea that that's going to be a NATO member and that the Americans may be able to put missiles that can hit Russia on Ukrainian territory is unacceptable. Furthermore, there's a very important naval base in Ukraine, in Sevastopol, which is located on the Crimean Peninsula. And from a Russian point of view, the idea that the Crimean Peninsula is going to become part of NATO and that Sevastopol may become a naval base is just unthinkable. This, again, is why Bill Burns, who's now the president of the head of the CIA, said in 2008 that Ukraine was the brightest of red lines. It really was or is of major strategic importance to the Russians. It's just very different than the Baltic states. It's very different than Finland, Poland, and so forth and so on. So the Russians are deeply committed to making sure that Ukraine never becomes a member of NATO, or if it does become a net member, it's a dysfunctional state and basically useless for NATO.
So the argument of people who see the world through the NATO and EU and US perspective is twofold about that argument. One is that no one was really talking about putting Ukraine in NATO. Secretary Blinken, when the Russians objected, defended this principle, this open door principle, that we're never going to close the door on anybody, that everyone has the right to join NATO. If we want them to, we're not going to tell Ukraine they're forever out. But that there was no real movement to put Ukraine into NATO. And that secondly, even if Ukraine did become a NATO state, NATO is purely a defensive alliance. It doesn't have a history of attacking anybody. All that it would do is be extending its defensive umbrella over Ukraine. If the Russian fears over NATO on the other side of their border was basically illusory, because NATO isn't the kind of military alliance that historically has gone and invaded other countries or conquered them. What do you make of those two claims?
Which was the first one again?
That no one was talking about NATO expansion into Ukraine in reality.
Yeah, this is simply not true. After the Biden administration moved into the White House in January of 2021, on a number of occasions over the course of 2021 and early 2022, they made it unequivocally clear that the commitment or pledge that was made in April of 2008 at Bucharest was alive and well. They said it in a statement that was made at the Brussels summit, the Brussels NATO summit in June of 2021. They said it in a very important strategic document that was issued in November 2021. And when the Russians wrote a letter on December 17th of 2021 asking President Biden to put in writing that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO, Tony Blinken made it clear to the Russians that we rejected that request and that Ukraine would become a part of NATO. That's part one of the story. Part two of the story is that Ukraine was effectively a de facto member of NATO by early 2022. The Russians made it clear that they appreciated this fact. We were arming the Ukrainians. We were training the Ukrainians. We were including them in military exercises that we ran, that NATO ran. We were obsessed with interoperability between Ukraine and NATO fighting forces. So Ukraine was well on its way to developing the military capability to be a NATO member. This idea that there was no chance that Ukraine would ever become part of NATO is a fiction that proponents of the war have invented to defend themselves. It makes no sense at all. Now, with regard to your second point, that NATO is a defensive alliance, it's a very important concept.
To be clear, that's not my point. That's the point of people who would be arguing against you. But go ahead.
Yes. No, I fully understand.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry for you. The second point is the argument that NATO is a defensive alliance. It's not an offensive alliance. There's a very important concept in the international relations literature. It's called the security dilemma. And the security dilemma says that it's virtually impossible to distinguish between defense and offense, whether you're talking about weapons or military strategy or military plans. So you can have an alliance that you think is defensive in nature, but if you're standing on the other side of the line, it does not look defensive in nature. It looks offensive in nature. Just let's go back to the Cold War. NATO had what I believe was a defensive strategy. But that defensive strategy involved lots of German and American and British armored divisions and mechanized infantry divisions. And in a crisis, what we planned to do was take all those NATO mechanized divisions and armored divisions and move them up to the inter-German border, close to where the Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces were. Well, if you're a Warsaw Pact general or a Soviet general sitting on the other side of the inter-German border, and all of a sudden you see German armored divisions and American armored divisions marching towards the border, are you going to say to yourself, those are defensive divisions? I don't think so. Are you going to be able to distinguish as to whether they're defensive or offensive divisions? I don't think so. The end result is what we have with regard to NATO expansion into Ukraine is a situation where on the Western side, we think this is a defensive move, whereas on the Russian side, they think it is an offensive move. Whereas we think we are containing the Russians think we are encircling them. This is the security dilemma. And people who make arguments about particular weapons or particular strategies or particular alliances being defensive in nature are whistling in the wind. It's a meaningless argument to make because you can't distinguish between defense and offense.
Let me ask you about the change of government in 2014. We all have heard the secret tape recording that's no longer secret, where Victoria Nuland was speaking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, and she expressed her very strong views about who ought to be the new president now that the democratically elected leader was removed from office prior to the constitutional termination of his term, obviously with a lot of U.S. aid that U.S. senators marched to Kiev and made no secret of the fact that they were aiding that effort. And we have this little scandal that gets talked about as a domestic scandal where Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, was on the board of Burisma for $50,000 a month because they wanted his help in dealing with some of their potential legal problems. And instead of paying a son of a Ukrainian official, they paid the son of an American official in recognition of that's who wielded real power in Ukraine, especially after the change in this government. How did that look, this change of government in 2014 and the subsequent influence of the United States in Ukraine to Moscow?
Well, I think that what happened in 2014 with regard to Victoria Nuland's behavior was seen by the Russians as a mortal threat. It's important to emphasize here that the Russians are deeply concerned about NATO expansion into Ukraine, for sure. But they're also concerned about EU expansion into Ukraine. And they are also deeply concerned about a potential color revolution in Ukraine. This is where Ukraine becomes a liberal democracy that's allied with the West. So if you actually think about the West strategy vis-a-vis Ukraine, it has three prongs to it, right? First is NATO expansion, second is EU expansion, and three is a color revolution. And the Russians worry about all three. And what happened with Victoria Nuland and the events in February of 2023 is that the Russians were spooked, not by NATO expansion per se at the time, but by a potential color revolution and also by EU expansion. Those were the two big issues on the table at the time. And the Russians clearly viewed this as a mortal threat. And that's why they took Crimea. And that's why the war, in effect, or the conflict, in effect, started back then. So those events in 2014, where the United States was involved, exactly how much involvement we had is unclear at this point in time. There's no question we were involved, but the level of involvement remains to be determined. But the Russians saw that as a threat, and that's what precipitated the crisis in February of 2014. With regard to Joe Biden's son, I don't know enough about that to have a strong opinion. I don't know enough about what Hunter Biden did, what Joe Biden did, or how the Russians view it. So I have to plead ignorance on that particular issue.
But regardless of the specifics of that case, it is true, isn't it, that after that 24 change of government, the United States played a much bigger role in the internal affairs of Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely. There's just no question about that.
Right.
No, we're joined at the hip with the Ukrainians. Just to go back to, you were talking about Barack Obama before being smart enough not to arm the Ukrainians. And you're absolutely correct. It was Donald Trump in December 2017 who decided to arm the Ukrainians. But Obama agreed to train the Ukrainians. Obama wanted to put limits on our involvement, for sure. He was a cautious man. And I think deep down inside, Obama understood that this whole situation was a potential disaster. But you don't want to underestimate the extent to which Obama moved the United States and Ukraine closer together after 2014. And again, Victoria Nuland worked for President Obama. And by the way, it was now President, then Vice President Biden, who handled the Ukraine portfolio in the Obama administration. I don't think most people realize that, but Obama delegated the Ukraine portfolio to Joe Biden. And Joe Biden worked closely with Victoria Nuland in 2014 and afterwards. And this is why when Joe Biden moves into the White House in January 2021, he really turns the pressure up on the Russians over Ukraine. 2021 is the year when the really big trouble starts. And it's Joe Biden who is in the White House starting in January of 2021.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.